Well, those of you watching now, if you've been watching across the last 2 weeks, you'll know that the biggest single issue in this crisis has been how countries ease their lockdowns without causing a spike in cases. And I'm going to start in Lebanon to illustrate just how hard this is going to be, because the government there has now reimposed its lockdown because of a new rise in cases. As you can see in these pictures, shops, restaurants and hair salons had been allowed to reopen, but now they're being told to close again. I should say the Lebanese government's approach through this crisis has been effective. The country's death toll is below 30, but as with many other countries, the government's trying to both save lives and the economy. And this is even more pressing in Lebanon, where the economy was already in a perilous state. Karine Torbay in Beirut has more.
Lebanon has started a 4-day shutdown that would expire by 5 a.m. on Monday. This is a setback for the country that was just days ago celebrating 0 new infections and was easing the lockdown and preparing for a gradual return to normal. Now things have worsened and there are renewed fears that things might go out of control again in case of an outbreak. There is also a sort of a blame game happening here. On one side, the government is saying that many in the society are not being as vigilant as they should, and they are not observing the necessary safety measures. On the other side, there is anger towards some of the Lebanese who have recently returned from abroad, who have tested positive, and a group among whom have not respected the requirements of self-isolation.
Next we turn to Saudi Arabia, where a lockdown's been announced for the Eid holiday, which will take place in around 10 days' time. Already Ramadan's been heavily disrupted. These pictures are of the Grand Mosque in Mecca holding night prayers for the first night of Ramadan. This was in April. Normally you'd see hundreds of thousands of people gathered for this, but not in 2020. Now, these new restrictions on the Eid holiday will run from May the 23rd to May the 27th. And of course, these are normally times of great celebration at the end of Ramadan. Those celebrations will still happen, but not as they normally do. And this is another example of how mindful governments are being of the virus surging back. Well, to China next, and of course it was the first to tackle this virus and the first to try and ease restrictions while controlling the number of cases. And already in China, we're seeing the kind of localized lockdowns that are likely to become a feature of life in many countries. Our focus today is Jilin. It's a city in the east of China. It's shutting down its transport links after a new cluster of coronavirus cases that's connected to one man. Now, no one in the city's population of 4 million can leave now unless they've tested negative. Here's more from our China correspondent, Stephen McDonnell.
It's being traced back to a cleaner in a large police station. This is a police station with special weapons police, with traffic police, hundreds of officers, and you can imagine why the authorities will be worried about the virus getting into a population like that. Now, it's not clear how the cleaner was originally infected, but one theory has been that it possibly came from the clothing of the police officers who have been at the front line in terms of doing coronavirus testing. Either way, what this shows you is that the Chinese government now has an attitude that if there's a cluster anywhere in this country, no matter how small it is, they are going to crush it, or at least try to, with very strict measures as a way of trying to prevent a second wave of this virus passing through the country where this global emergency first started.
Russia now, and it's having far less success than China in containing the virus. It's reported more than 10,000 cases for the 11th consecutive day. That brings its overall total of cases to over 240,000. Now, earlier this week, President Putin announced that businesses will go back to work, and cities, as you can see, had been noticeably busier. But the government is still under pressure. The health ministry has had to deny that it's underreporting the number of fatalities. The official statistic is 2,200, but just as we discussed yesterday with reference to the UK, many statisticians feel the most accurate measure is to compare how many deaths we'd expect per week at this time of year, and then compare it with what's happening in 2020. Do that in Russia, and it looks like the death toll could be over 3 times higher. For the moment, though, the government is continuing with its plans for Russian society to reopen. Now, as we continue to try and understand the easing of restrictions and how they impact on societies, Denmark is very useful. While lots of countries are just beginning this process, well, Danish children have already been back at school for a month. And the BBC's Jean Mackenzie has been looking at how that's working.
The school's been cleverly redrawn, so each child only comes into contact with a very small number of other children.
Normally they sit 2 and 2. You have the class of 20, it's been cut down to 2 groups of 10. That's why you have the plastic.
Because those 2 groups aren't allowed to mix?
No, exactly. When they're going outside on the breaks, we have to divide those groups into even smaller groups.
So the kids just have 4 other children that they're allowed to play with, and they're only given one part of the playground that they're allowed to be in.
And there's a lot of this.
How many times do you wash your hands a day now?
5 to 6.
Denmark reopened primary schools very early on. It was feared the infection rate would rise, and initially it did, but it's back down again. And with so many parents in work here, this was a targeted risk.
If we had to get the economy moving again, then we need to get the kids back into not only schools but also daycare to try to enhance productivity for those forced still to work at home.
It was a challenge to do your job while having him home. It's much more easy for me to concentrate, have a row of hours where I can just work.
This, they said, was impossible. Children, social distancing. Now, it might not be school as they know it, but they're making it work.
So some better news there from Denmark. More better news as well from Taiwan. It's reporting 0 new cases for a 6th day in a row. That's evidence that the virus can be contained. But of course, the challenge here is to keep it that way while allowing some elements of normal life at least to resume. And Kasia, that challenge, as we've been seeing in all those examples, is one that's being faced by many countries around the world at the moment.